Now we're moving up to 1853, and Manifest Destiny was in full swing, and this is the era of the Oregon Trail and people flocking to the west, many of them because they were getting free land, the donation land claims were available, and of course there was also a little, maybe you might find some gold, and there were possibilities for a lot of younger folks that were coming across the Oregon Trail to stake out the West and see what it was like. In 1853, Job and Sarah Lamley, and we'll see, there's a picture of their house. They built a stately home on their donation land claim here. And interestingly enough, on that deed that they got, guess what? It was labeled as Todd's Bay. So we know from Jane Barnes' story why that name was established here. Job has an interesting story. He crossed the plains in 1849 and he arrived in Oregon City. And he was lured here by the prospect of gold, not here, but in California. So he said, I'm going to go down to Astoria and catch a ride down to San Francisco, and I'm going to go out and look for some gold. Well, the ship he got in Oregon City, the Josephine, did not make it very far. It shipwrecked, crossing that treacherous bar, and here is Job. And he survived, but he dragged ashore across the river, almost in Owaco, Washington, and managed to survive, and he was quite entrepreneurial. He got odd jobs here and there, and eventually he met Sarah Wilson, who had also crossed the Oregon Trail. She came with her parents, and she was actually a shoestring relative of President Wilson. And the families had known each other back east, so they kind of knew each other. But anyway, they got married in 1847, and that was when they built the first structure that was really built on this piece of land. And they built this beautiful, stately home right down by the river here. They had a lovely river view, and Job was a seafaring man by that time, a pilot on the river. We found artifacts that from that house. The house was demolished when the government bought the land. It was in disrepair and it was burned. But when my mother was out poking around doing gardening after my folks acquired this site, she found some artifacts, and she found these little doll parts and some of the hardware that had probably been on a piece of furniture that had, after the burn, that was salvaged. So that's evidence of this pioneer family that settled here in the mid-1840s.
In 1876, Joseph and Sarah Lamley, who had the donation land claim here, sold the western portion of their property to Joseph Hume, who was one of 4 Hume brothers who had many canneries on this river. In fact, between the 4 of them, there were they had over half of the 40 canneries that were here on this river. Joseph Hume was the youngest brother, and we know that he was here. We have 3 really wonderful salmon labels that we have had a lot of fun with. The first one, you can see as salmon labels came along in history, they got better. The first one we have is a very crude drawing. It's got a picture of Joseph Hume, the world renowned. It's a very simple label. And the early canning labels were often printed in red. And that was because the early canning methods often produced cans that rusted pretty easily. So the red disguised the rust on the early labels. The next label we have is a really special label that just came into our museum a year ago. It was the granddaughter of Dr. Bayless Earle, who was one of the first assistant surgeons here when the station was just being transformed into a quarantine station from the cannery building. It was in the possession of his granddaughter, so we assume that Dr. Bayless Earle must have found some labels hanging around the buildings here. And this is another beautiful red label, but you can see the picture of the salmon is a little more detailed. It's a very beautiful label, and it's got a very fun image over on the right-hand side where you have a globe and you have 2 women, one dressed in an American flag type outfit, holding hands across the ocean with someone of royalty on the other side. And so this tells you they were really marketing to the whole world here. The salmon was going everywhere. It was huge. There were a lot of cans of salmon. being made here. And then our very favorite salmon label, which is the first one we came, that we found actually, is very, very beautiful. And you can see on this label we have the salmon, but we also have Lady Liberty. And so the fun thing about labels is that you look back into history and you see the cultural events that were captivating the country at the time, or the world in fact. And you may know that the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France to us, and it was delivered in the late 1800s, about 1880s, somewhere in there. And so they were putting this on a label. They were selling this beautiful artwork on the label around the world. And instead of a torch, if you zoom in, you will see she is holding a salmon in her hand, and then in the other hand that normally would hold the tablet, she's got a huge can of salmon. It's really showing the opportunity here for the world to come over here to America. The other thing to note is that you'll see a bridge in the background of this label. Well, we didn't have a bridge out here until about the 1960s, so this was not, this was a dream. You could kind of see that Astorians were hoping they were the next New York. This looks quite a bit like New York Harbor at the time. The other very interesting thing about that label is that it was only after this label would have been produced and used on these cans from the cannery here that we had a quarantine station here. So this symbol that's associated with Ellis Island was really rather prophetic in being on this can, because we became the Ellis Island of this region. So very fun history to see how things are woven in here. Another thing interesting to note is the Hume brothers were the first to employ the Chinese laborers here. They were hard workers. They weren't allowed to fish in the river, but they were kept in these cannery buildings, and they cut up these fish, day and night, canning all these cans of salmon. We know that from the 1880 census, there were 70 Chinese people employed here at the station, and when you look at the pictures of the cannery buildings here, you can see there were 2 levels, and it's quite likely they did the work on the lower level and then lived above on the top level. And we find a lot of Chinese shards out in our grounds here. They still come up from time to time. And we find other things like clay pipes, and we have a couple sake bottles that were under the porch that Grandma found. So there are some clues that we did indeed have a pretty thriving Chinese population here for a time.